Black men have always been some of the first to volunteer for military service. 370,000 African Americans served in the military during World War I. 80 to 100,000 of them also saw combat. Many of them felt like this was the pathway to full citizenship for African Americans. The belief that amongst many whites, especially in the South though, was that blacks were inferior and shouldn't wear the uniform. They didn't care for the attitude and pride and self-worth exhibited by black soldiers and saw it as a sign of arrogance and a threat to the status quo. Mississippi Senator James K. Vardaman stated, "Whites are opposed to putting arrogant, strutting representatives of the black man in every community." Welcome to One Mic. I'm your host, Country Boy. This is the first episode 1, Season 1. Today we're going to talk about the Houston Riot of 1917. If you like this, you enjoy this, please consider donating to our Patreon page, and I hope you enjoy it. When the United States declared war on Germany in the spring of 1917 and later in 1917, the passage of the Selective Service Act removed the Army's quota that limited black enlistment based on their percentage of the population. This introduced a large number of blacks in the military and enabled the United States to ramp up to the war effort. Whites, on the other hand, didn't see any reason to change their attitude towards black soldiers. Most people in the South wanted nothing to do with black soldiers invading their town. And war officials initially decided against sending black recruits into the South for training. But Newton D. Baker, the war secretary for Woodrow Wilson, reversed this decision because he felt like it conflicted with military traditions. Baker, who was well aware of the potential racial issues, ordered his officers to exercise discretion and judgment to prevent any difficulty from arriving in this case. Texas in particular was infamous for its low tolerance for African American men in uniform. The war effort apparently took a back seat to maintaining the state's racial hierarchy. During the Spanish-American War of 1898, the All Black 10th Cavalry received unprovoked sniper fire from white civilians. The frequency was so bad that the commanding officers requested a military escort for the troops in areas they were supposed to be protecting. In 1906, 106 members of the All Black 25th Infantry was dishonorably discharged and imprisoned after being accused of conducting an unprovoked raid on Brownsville, Texas. Even though none of the men were ever identified, and investigators testified that the men were persistent in camp and all their weapons remained clean and unfired. So when the War Department ordered the All Black 3rd Battalion 24th Infantry into Houston, Texas for a guard duty during the construction of Camp Logan, the War Department actually felt like this would actually minimize racial conflict. Colonel William Newman knew there was going to be an issue, and the battalion's commander attempted to get the orders revoked. He stated later that he had an unfortunate experience where he was commanding 2 companies of the 24th Infantry in Del Rio, Texas, where a black soldier was killed by a Texas Ranger because it angered Texans to see a colored man in uniform. Later, Colonel Newman decided against revoking his orders, and the 24th Infantry arrived in Houston on July 28, 1917. Within hours, the soldiers experienced Texas under Jim Crow. The community in Houston was thick with racial tension and resentment because they had replaced an all-white National Guard regiment. The citizens expected the troops to behave in the fashion of local blacks and just accept the brutality, harassment, and racial epithets without comment or retaliation. The troops of the 24th were not welcome, and the locals made sure they were aware of this. The locals felt like their status as a soldier was negated by their race. The construction workers that they were attempting to protect during the construction of Camp Logan called them niggers on a regular basis and asked for their water to be separate. The local police used to berate, harass, and beat the soldiers. The men's status as soldiers meant nothing to the people of Houston. The 24th also spent most of their time in Columbus, New Mexico, and Manila, places where they faced little racial discrimination. So the soldiers of the 24th were not fully prepared for the hell of racism and Jim Crow in Texas at the turn of the 20th century. By this point, Colonel Newman was well aware of the issues the 24th faced in Houston and went to great lengths to avoid conflict, reduce tension, and hostility. Colonel Newman ordered all his men to be disarmed and their weapons to be placed under lock and key. He felt that disarmed troops would be treated as less of a threat by the locals and reduce the possibility of retaliation on the part of the soldiers. Only guards on the outskirts of the camp were allowed to have weapons, and they were only allowed to have rifles and 5 rounds of ammunition. Initially, this did work out to lessen racial tensions. Then, on August 20th, Colonel Newman was replaced by Major Nealon Snow, who assumed control of 3rd Battalion and immediately realized they were sitting on a powder keg and he needed to do everything in his power to prevent it from popping off. During the morning of August 23, 1917, the incident most feared actually occurred. The incident triggered by weeks of insults and police brutality. Lee Sparks, who was a policeman in Houston, was by all accounts the worst of the worst. In terms of race relations with the blacks, he took pride in putting blacks in their place and had a reputation for being a bully and a race baiter. So on the morning of the 23rd, when Lee Sparks and his partner Rufus Daniels patrolled Houston's predominantly black San Felipe district and saw 2 men playing dice, they attempted to stop the 2 men. And the 2 men ran into the house of a woman named Sarah Travers. The police came into the house looking for the 2 men and didn't find the suspect, but exchanged words with Sarah Travers. The police beat her and dragged her out of her house in a nightgown. As Sparks and Daniels attempted to call into the arrest at an area police box, they were approached by a private Alonzo Edwards, who had saw the incident and attempted to ask the officers what this was about. He offered to take custody of Travers. He was then pistol whipped and arrested by the officers. Later, Corporal Charles Baltimore, a black MP, approached Lee Sparks and Rufus Daniels to inquire about the arrest of Private Edwards earlier in the day. Baltimore asked what the trouble had been about, why the soldier had been arrested, and Sparks answered, "What, you don't like it?" Before Baltimore could even answer, Sparks hit him with his service revolver, and as Baltimore attempted to run away, they fired at Baltimore, and he hid under a house. When they located Baltimore, they beat him and hit him with their service revolver. Later, Sparks would explain that Baltimore approached him using profanity. However, his partners, Rufus Daniels, refused to confirm this story, and it seemed to insinuate that Sparks was not telling the truth. After the incident, a rumor reached the camp of the 24th that Baltimore had been shot and killed, and that the white mob was planning to attack the camp. According to investigators, the soldiers immediately began to form small groups and discuss a possible march on the city of Houston and attack on the police. Major Snow, in an attempt to ease tensions, reached out to the police chief and was able to locate Baltimore alive but severely beaten. He was able to secure his release by explaining that he was just carrying out his duties as an MP. He also was able to get the police chief to order his men to refrain from calling the soldiers niggers, and that Lee Sparks would be suspended pending investigation. To further attempt to prevent a clash between his men and the people of Houston, Major Snow canceled all passes that evening and posted extra guards around the camp. Major Snow believed he had diffused the situation, but tensions amongst the black soldiers remained high because they feared they had been disarmed and would be unable to defend themselves against a pending mob attack. It's tough to understand what actually caused fear of a mob attack to lead to the riot. We understand the events leading up to the riot, but what actually sparked the riot is cause for debate. What we're left with is 2 theories about what actually caused the riot. The first being that the soldiers were angry about the beating of Corporal Baltimore at the hands of a racist police officer, decided to conspire against cause and create panic to seek revenge on the white officers and the people of Houston. In this theory, Sergeant Vida Henry, who committed suicide during the attack, was the lead conspirator and deliberately deceived his superiors, even tricking them into seizing all the weapons in order to create fear amongst the 24th. The argument for this theory comes from testimony during the trial, and those that testified against the soldiers had a vested interest in placing the blame exclusively on the soldiers of the 24th and Henry, who died that night. The second theory is the riot was a spur-of-the-moment decision rather than a premeditated plot. The men only left camp after being fired upon first. Next, believing that they were under attack, began to grab their seized weapons and return fire. There's some evidence to support this theory. The soldiers only had military weapons, and the initial shots fired near camp loading, according to testimonies, didn't sound like rifle fire. Also, the wounded near camp's wounds didn't result from military-issued weapons, and the bullets in the nearby homes near Camp Logan also didn't come from military-issued weapons. The soldiers would later testify that they only left camp to form a skirmish line to meet their oncoming attackers. In this theory, Sergeant Vida Henry, who was the lead conspirator in the first, gets swept up in the riot after failing to stop his soldiers from seizing their weapons and stopping them from disobeying orders and leaving camp. This theory is backed up by Major Snow, who later testified that Henry warned him that there was going to be trouble that night, and Colonel Newman, who testified that he was one of the few soldiers that actually liked it in Houston, and also is quoted as saying that he was of unquestioned loyalty and had been given responsibilities above his capabilities. Once the riot was sparked, though, the soldiers began firing indiscriminately on the surrounding buildings. After several minutes of shooting, the 150 plus soldiers left Camp Logan and marched towards the San Felipe district. They marched for over 2 hours. The soldiers stopped a car carrying 2 policemen. The 2 policemen were quickly disarmed and shot and killed. Later, a group of 6 officers stumbled upon the group of soldiers. One of those officers being Rufus Daniels, who was a partner of Lee Sparks. Rufus Daniels was armed only with his service revolver and was quickly cut down. The men began to beat his body with their rifle butts and bayonets. It was believed that the black soldiers were attempting to march on the police station, so the white locals, upon hearing of the riot, began to form large groups of over 200 men to guard the business district and the police station. This is the point where everything changed for the 24th. They were approached by a man wearing an olive khaki uniform. The soldiers shot the man, believing he was a member of the Houston Mounted Police, but in actuality they had killed one of their own, Captain Joseph Matty of the Illinois National Guard. The killing of a military officer seemed to drive home the seriousness of their actions and the pending consequences. It seemed to change their whole way of thinking, and the group of men immediately stopped and discussed for 2 hours what would be their plan of action. Many of the soldiers began to desert the group, and the remaining soldiers decided to return to Camp Logan, all except Provider Henry, who had apparently been injured in the shooting. He asked the soldiers to please put him out of his misery and shoot him. All of the soldiers refused. So after the group said their goodbyes and they left for Camp Logan, Sergeant Provider Henry committed suicide, most likely understanding the seriousness of his offense and the harshness of punishment that would take place. He decided to kill himself rather than wait for the army to dictate their execution. In the aftermath, 21 people were killed, including 5 soldiers and 5 policemen and 11 civilians. The War Department immediately shipped the 24th out of Houston to Columbus, New Mexico, to the protest of city officials. They wanted to try the soldiers in Houston, believing they had jurisdiction, and that justice could only be carried out by their hands. Houston was also placed under martial law, and city officials formed the Houston Civilian Board of Inquiry to investigate the riot. They called 92 witnesses. Most of their testimony came from hearsay, and none of them actually witnessed any of the violence. In the nights after the riot, racial tensions in Houston remained extremely high. The police under martial law began to perform raids on black homes and seize weapons, believing that the soldiers could not have worked alone. Many of the local blacks decided to leave Houston in the aftermath of the riots, believing Houston had reached its racial tipping point. 118 soldiers were arrested and charged with murder and mutiny. The court-martial was held in Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio. Army investigators were able to get 7 soldiers to testify against the other soldiers with promises of immunity and leniency. The Army broke up the trials into 3 groups, the first being a trial of 63 soldiers held on November 1st, 1917. At the time, it was the largest court-martial in the continental United States. Their defense attorney, a Major Harry Geiger, was not even an attorney. Apparently, you don't have to be an actual attorney to defend someone in the military code of justice. And Major Geiger just happened to be associated with the 24th at one time, but had no actual legal training. Also, the list of the soldiers that were put on trial was made from roll call that was done during the actual riot. And it's totally possible that participants in the riot never faced justice, and people who didn't participate in the riot were put on trial. None of the victims of the riot could identify any of the actual soldiers, and the only witnesses they had were the 7 soldiers that testified that they gave leniency to. On November 28th, the court gave its verdict. 54 of the 63 were found guilty on all charges. 41 were sentenced to Leavenworth, Kansas for their natural life. 5 were acquitted, and 13 men were sentenced to death for masterminding a riot. One of those men being Charles Baltimore, who was charged for being the spark that caused the riot. Of the rest of the soldiers, 15 were tried on December 17th, and the last 40 were tried on February 18th. Although tried, 10 of them were given death sentences. President Woodrow Wilson later commuted those 10 death sentences to life in prison and even issued a rare statement so that his actions could be a matter of record. He explained that each of the 3 proceedings, the court had been properly constituted and was composed of officers of experience and sobriety of judgment, and that extraordinary precautions were taken to ensure fairness in these trials. Wilson also affirmed the earlier death sentences because there was plain evidence of deliberate engagement in shocking brutality. He also stated that he commuted the remaining 10 sentences because he believed that a lesson of lawlessness during the riot had already been adequately pointed. He desired that the splendid loyalty of African American soldiers be recognized and expressed, and hoped that clemency would inspire them to further zeal and service of their country. The 13 men that were sentenced to death didn't even find out they were going to die till the morning of the execution. The Army told the media that the execution was going to take place in Leon Springs on another day, so there was no press coverage. The Army, expecting the worst, formed a guard of 200 soldiers to assist in the execution of the black soldiers. In their final words, they said goodbye to the boys of the C Company, and they were hanged simultaneously at 7/17. The men died with dignity in the face of injustice, and they were buried in unmarked graves until 1937, when the fort needed the ground for training. Later investigations found that the men had not been dishonorably discharged before their hanging. The military was authorized to bury the soldiers in a national cemetery in the city of Houston. The soldiers were able to find the respect they were looking for in death that they never found in life. Thank you for listening to One Mic, a Black History podcast. I'm your host, Country Boy. If you enjoyed this story, I'm going to continue to do this every month, and you can donate to our Patreon page. Also support the Cut Podcast. We're putting out content constantly. And peace.